The American Story, The Beginnings, by David Barton and Tim Barton, as read by Karl Hirsch. The American Story highlights some of the interesting moments and people that reveal God's providence in America. We have a fascinating history that must be remembered and passed on to future generations. Section 5, The American Republic. Chapters 4 through 7, Missionaries and Mission Movements, the Whitmans in Washington, Slavery in the World, Slavery in America, and Early American Anti-Slavery Efforts. Other leaders significant to the development of the Pacific Northwest included the husband and wife missionary team of Marcus, 1802 to 1847, and Narcissa Whitman, 1808 to 1847. They were key in founding the states of Washington and Idaho. The two grew up about the same time as Jason Lee, but were from a different part of the country, what was called the Burned Over District of Central New York. It received that name because the revival fires of religion had so often burned through that region. Marcus and Narcissa lived in different parts of that area and did not yet know one another. Each separately became Christians during the Second Great Awakening. Young Narcissa was passionate about her faith. At the age of 16, she determined to become a missionary and began reading books and periodicals on the subject. Well educated for a young woman of her day, she became a school teacher but continued to pursue the opportunity to become a missionary. Marcus was equally fervent in his faith and wanted to become a minister, but his family urged him to become a medical doctor instead. So he followed the path preferred by his parents and became a physician. In 1833, the 1833 periodical about Indians seeking the, quote, white man's book of heaven, end quote, that had changed the course of Jason Lee's life, had an equally dramatic impact on the lives of Marcus and Narcissa. After the Reverend Samuel Parker of Massachusetts read that article, he began traveling throughout New York, recruiting missionaries to go among the Western Indians. Narcissa and Marcus, who had never met, each heard Parker speak in separate meetings in different parts of the state, and both responded to his call. Narcissa applied to the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, but discovered that they did not accept unmarried women. Marcus likewise applied to become a medical missionary, but similarly learned that they were not seeking unmarried men. The reason was that family units historically proved to be the most effective and best equipped for building new settlements, colonies, or cultures. The Reverend Parker, who knew both Marcus and Narcissa, introduced them to each other, and 2 days later they were engaged. The following day, Marcus set out on horseback to scout for a trail on which they could later travel west. It was a full year before he saw Narcissa again. During that westward exploration, Marcus arrived at a rendezvous of mountain men, where he learned much about the area where they would be traveling. While there, Marcus used his medical training and extracted a 3-inch iron arrow point from legendary mountain man Jim Bridger that had become embedded in him 3 years earlier during a fight with the Blackfeet. That successful operation established Marcus as a respected man of medicine. His reputation quickly spread among the mountain men and the people of the West. Having identified a path they could travel, and now knowing something about what they would face on the trek, Marcus returned east. He and Narcissa were married on February 18, 1836, and left the next day. The 3,000-mile westward journey by horseback and wagon would last nearly 7 months. Marcus had recruited a few others to go with them, including the Reverend Henry Spalding and his wife, Eliza. Narcissa and Eliza became the first two Anglo women to cross the Rocky Mountains. As they traveled through the various travel areas, Narcissa became a genuine attraction. The Western natives had never seen a white woman before, and they would gather round to stare at her. As Narcissa noted, quote, "We ladies were such a curiosity to them. They would come and stand around our tent, peep in, and grin in their astonishment to see such looking objects." End quote. The trail chosen by Marcus was essentially new. It had been used 30 years earlier by Eastern trapper and mountain man John Jacob Astor, but he never publicized it. 2 decades after that, Jedediah Smith rediscovered the trail and mapped it, but when the Whitmans traveled it, it was still relatively unknown and unused. Narcissa kept a journal of their travels. Her writings generated much excitement when they were later sent back east and printed. They not only influenced an entire generation of girls to do great things outside of the traditional mold, but when other women and families learned Narcissa had made the trip, they too were willing to try. This helped launch the widespread movement of the settlers to the west. The Rocky Mountains were a formidable range that was nearly impossible to cross, except in 2 areas, one in the north and one in the south. The northern pass used by the Whitmans would eventually become known as the Oregon Trail. The southern pass became known as the Santa Fe Trail. When the Whitman party finally reached the Continental Divide, the American mountain ridge that separates the east from the west, fellow traveler Reverend Henry Spalding reported that, quote, "They alighted from their horses, and kneeling on the other half of the continent with the Bible in one hand and the American flag in the other, took possession of it as the home of American mothers and of the Church of Christ." End quote. The Whitmans were now on the downhill side of their journey, finishing their trek weeks later at the Hudson Bay Company's Walla Walla trading post in what is today's Washington State. The Whitman party had arrived in an unmanageably large territory, and also unknowingly found themselves surrounded with political intrigue beyond their control. The vast territory was rich in natural resources, especially furs, which had become a popular and high-demand commodity in Europe. As early as the 1770s, ships from various nations traveled to the Pacific Northwest to trade with Indian tribes for furs, which they later sold at a large profit. Despite the competing claims of other nations to that territory, Great Britain felt the entire region was hers, and her Hudson Bay Company established a trading monopoly with various tribes, buying every fur they could from them and making a sizable income. To discourage competition in this lucrative enterprise, the company conducted an extensive propaganda campaign back east, portraying the region as a vast, uninhabitable, and uncultivable desert. They worked hard to discourage settlers from moving west. Unrealized to the Whitmans, their arrival represented a direct threat to the economic health of the Hudson Bay Company. Because women such as Narcissa and Eliza had now made the journey, more families and settlers would surely follow. These newcomers would establish settlements, and the additional hunting and fishing would threaten the company's monopoly. It therefore quietly stirred up animosity toward the new missionaries. The Whitmans were Protestants, so Catholic missionaries who worked with the Bay Company began telling the tribes the evils of Protestantism, creating hostility against them in hopes that this would cause them to give up and return east. But at that time, the Whitmans knew nothing of these secret efforts. They settled in the area of the Cayuse Indians and set up a mission. Narcissa was pregnant at the time, and their daughter Clarissa was born shortly after their arrival. The tribe was thrilled with the new baby, who grew up speaking both English and Cayuse, being fully bilingual by age 2. But despite what appeared to be a good start, 5 serious problems developed that eventually became insurmountable and doomed their efforts. First, unknown to the Whitmans, the Cayuse were a semi-nomadic people who moved with the seasons, sometimes hunting, fishing, or gathering. So, for much of the year, there were no natives at the mission for Marcus and Narcissa to minister to and work with. Second, the Cayuse were a communal people. They went freely into any lodge in their village, and they owned all things in common. There was no concept of personal space or private property. The Cayuse therefore entered the Whitmans' house, including their private quarters at any time. Narcissa became very uncomfortable. In her structured life back east, she had become accustomed to personal boundaries, and she expected it of others. Third, the Cayuse rarely bathed, and whatever Narcissa had, they were always asking for, whether possessions, food, or money. She therefore considered them not only dirty, but also lazy. She expected them to conform to her expectations rather than vice versa. She wanted them to learn English, but she had no intention of learning Cayuse. Unable to adapt, Narcissa began building physical fences and boundaries around her house to keep the Cayuse from entering. This, of course, greatly offended them, for they had no understanding of her way of life, which was so vastly different from their own. And like Narcissa, they similarly did not appreciate her refusing to conform to their culture. Fourth, the Whitmans experienced great personal tragedy when 2-year-old Clarissa fell into the river near the mission and drowned. Narcissa never fully recovered from the emotional devastation. She abandoned mission work and became isolated. She eventually took in 10 foster children of various Anglo settlers who had died, and those children became the center of her life. She closed everything else off. Amidst these difficulties, in February of 42, Marcus learned that the Board of Missions had withdrawn their financial support of the Whitmans and the mission. He immediately set out for the east, crossing the fierce and rugged mountains during winter to argue for the reinstatement of their funding. He was successful in his efforts. He also stopped in Washington, D.C. and met with political officials, urging them to turn serious federal attention toward the Oregon Territory. On his way home, Marcus came upon 120 wagons and 1,000 settlers in Missouri contemplating the trek west. But, fearing the passage too difficult for either wagons or women, Whitman explained that both his wagon and his wife had already made the journey, and he offered to guide them. They agreed, resulting in what was known as the Great Migration of 1843. The fifth difficulty the Whitmans faced was tribal tradition and superstition, which ultimately resulted in their deaths. Marcus was considered a medicine man among the Cayuse, and he used his medical skills to serve and treat them, nursing many to health from various maladies. However, in 1847, a measles epidemic hit the tribe, and although Marcus worked tirelessly, the outbreak was especially deadly among native children, and nearly half died. A Cayuse custom held that if a medicine man treated someone and they did not recover, then the family of the deceased had the right to kill the medicine man. In other words, anything less than 100% success rate could result in death. So in November, some Cayuse went to the mission, silently walked up behind Marcus, and buried a tomahawk in his skull, instantly killing him. Then they shot Narcissa, whipped her, and dumped her body in the mud outside the house. They killed a total of 14 people from the mission. The massacre turned federal attention toward the territory, and the martyred Marcus Whitman became one of the better-known figures of the 1800s. Efforts were begun to make that territory a safer and more secure location for Americans. Eventually, the region became an official territory of the United States and was later divided into several states. In retrospect, Narcissa, who had been sheltered all her life, had good intentions but sadly did not comprehend the enormity of the new lifestyle required of her in the West. She lacked the resiliency necessary to learn new customs and overcome the tragic loss of her beloved daughter. These factors contributed to her lamentably negative approach both in thinking and behavior. But Marcus was able to adapt, understanding what was needed. He had an overall substantial positive impact on the region, generously expending himself and trying to improve the lives and cultures of the tribes to which he ministered. Just as Oregon placed a statue of hero Jason Lee at the U.S. Capitol, medical missionary Marcus Whitman, with a large Bible under his arm, was similarly honored at the Capitol by Washington State. Jason Lee and the Whitmans are just a few in the long line of Christian leaders who helped establish the entirety of what became the continental United States. While much of the focus in the western United States was on exploration and expansion, in the eastern half of the nation, no subject received more attention than that of slavery. It existed for nearly 2.5 centuries in America before it was finally abolished. Some modern activists and academics act as if slavery is a uniquely American problem. The New York Times 1619 Project, for instance, asserts that the barbaric institution was the defining element of our country's history. This is nonsense. Slavery is indeed a great evil, but it is a human evil, not a distinctively American evil. Over the history of the world, we have yet to find a race that at one time was not enslaved and also enslaved others. Every race has been both victim and oppressor. Thus, the history of every nation and every race prior to the 20th century involves slavery, demonstrating that slavery is without a singular color. To help set the global perspective in the 3.5 centuries of the African slave trade, 1501 to 1875, some 12.5 million Africans were taken as slaves to other nations. 46% of them, about 5.8 million, were made slaves in Portuguese holdings, 26% in English ones, 3.3 million, 11% in French, 1.4 million, 8% in Spanish, 1.1 million, and 4% in Dutch, 0.6 million. Only 2.4% of the enslaved Africans, or 3,300,000, were brought to the United States. Originally, American colonies had indentured servants, but no slaves. At that time, an indenture was similar to arranging a loan. Imagine that a young man wanted to leave Europe and come to America where he could have individual freedom, own his own land, and make his own way. He finds that the cost of passage to America is too expensive, and he can't afford the trip. He therefore enters an agreement with a sponsor to pay for his passage in exchange for working a fixed number of years. He essentially gives himself up to be his own temporary collateral on that loan. After the agreed-to period of time, his service is complete and he receives a piece of land that he can then begin to work for himself. This is what is meant to be an indentured servant. In 1619, or shortly thereafter, a black man, Anthony Johnson, arrived in America and presumably became an indentured servant. Over time, he became a prosperous landowner, amassing 250 acres and considerable wealth. He began sponsoring immigration to the colony, employing indentured servants to work for him. After a dispute with one of his black servants, Johnson went to court seeking the permanent ownership of that servant, and in 1654, the court granted him that man's service for life. This was the first occasion of legal slavery in America that was not punishment for a crime or criminal offense, or for those captured in a just war. and it occurred when a black man sued to own another black man. The New York Times 1619 Project and many academics assert that slavery in American colonies began in 1619. But this is almost certainly incorrect. In 1619, British privateers captured a Portuguese slave trading ship and brought the slaves to sell in Jamestown. But instead of remaining slaves, they became indentured servants. After serving several years, they were given their freedom and awarded land. Thus, 1619 is not when African slavery began in the American colonies. Instead, it was at the time of the 1654 legal decision in favor of Johnson. African Americans owning other African Americans is not as isolated as it might seem. Carter Woodson, 1875 to 1950, a famous black historian known as, quote, the father of black history, conducted extensive research in U.S. Census data. He found that in the 1830 census, 43% of free black households in South Carolina owned black slaves, as did 40% of free black households in Louisiana, 26% in Mississippi, 25% in Alabama, and 20% in Georgia. And blacks owned slaves in the North as well as the South. Native American tribes also owned black slaves. According to the census of 1860, in the Choctaw, Cherokee, Creek, and Chickasaw tribes, 1 out of every 8 persons, or 12%, was an African American slave. Strikingly, a higher percentage of Native Americans owned black slaves than white Americans, and the same is true for free black households in the American South. Furthermore, Indian slavery of other Indians was very common and had been practiced by Native Americans long before the arrival of either Anglos or Africans. Because Indian tribes are considered separate and independent nations under the American constitutional law, when the 13th Amendment abolished slavery across the nation in 1865, it did not affect Indian tribes. Slavery in Indian tribes continued, but finally ended when the federal government negotiated subsequent treaties. Whites were also enslaved in the United States. In fact, up to the 16th century, there were more documented white slaves in the Old World than black slaves in the New World. And from the 16th through 18th centuries, Muslims alone took some 1.25 million white slaves. Their emphasis was more on enslaving infidels than any particular race. But numerous white American Christians were captured off ships in the Mediterranean and made slaves of Muslims. So, slavery has historically existed in all races and in all nations. In America, most slaves were blacks owned by whites. But even so, in 1860, at the height of the American slavery, only 8% of American families owned slaves. And while some large plantations owned hundreds of slaves, the average slave owner held between 1 and 5. Still, it is noteworthy that the overwhelming majority of whites never owned a slave. These facts are not to excuse America's participation in this horrific evil. Rather, this is to provide context to the reality that slavery was a universally embraced practice among all groups. There is clearly much more to the story of slavery in America than the simplistic portrayal that has become common today. To understand more about how slavery was finally abolished in America, we must return to the First Great Awakening and the American War for Independence, which were major turning points in the national attitude against slavery. In 1773, Pennsylvania passed an anti-slavery law to prohibit the slave trade, as did Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Massachusetts. But the following year, King George III vetoed those American anti-slavery laws. Slavery was practiced throughout the British Empire and was a rich source of income. As long as America was part of the British Empire, it too would engage in slavery and the slave trade. Many founders openly denounced Great Britain, first for imposing the evil of slavery upon the colonies, and then for vetoing their efforts to end the slave trade. In Thomas Jefferson's original draft of the Declaration, one of the longest grievances he penned condemned the slave trade, vigorously protesting. He, King George III, has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. Determined to keep open a market where men should be bought and sold, he has prostituted his negative for suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit or to restrain this inexorable commerce. That is, the king had vetoed efforts to prohibit the slave trade. Benjamin Franklin had early affirmed that whenever the Americans attempted to end slavery, the British government had thwarted those attempts, explaining that a disposition to abolish slavery prevails in North America, that many of the Pennsylvanians have set their slaves at liberty, and that even the Virginia Assembly have petitioned the king for permission to make a law for preventing the importation of more into that colony. This request, however, will probably not be granted, as their former laws of that kind have always been repealed by the king. Regrettably, the delegates from the pro-slavery states of South Carolina and Georgia rejected Jefferson's denunciation of the slave trade from the Declaration. The reason that only 2 states from the total of 13 were successful in removing this clause was that nothing could appear in the Declaration unless it had the full agreement of all the states. As the document itself attested, it was the, quote, unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America, end quote. Because these 2 states dissented, the national condemnation of the slave trade was removed. Yet, this did not prevent many founders and many more Americans from working against slavery. For example, after the king's veto of Pennsylvania's 1773 anti-slavery law, in 1774, America's first anti-slavery society was formed, the Pennsylvania Society for Promoting the Abolition of Slavery. It was expanded after the war, and Declaration signer Benjamin Franklin became its president, and fellow signer Benjamin Rush one of its leaders. In 1785, John Jay, who later became the first Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, and after that the Governor of New York, helped found and became president of an anti-slavery society in New York. When William Livingston, the Governor of New Jersey, and soon to be signer of the Constitution, heard of the New York Anti-Slavery Society, he wrote its leaders offering, "I would most ardently wish to become a member of it," the society in New York, "and I can safely promise them that neither my tongue, nor my pen, nor purse shall be wanting to promote the abolition of what to me appears so inconsistent with humanity and Christianity. May the great and the equal Father of the human race, who has expressly declared his abhorrence of oppression, Proverbs 14:31, 22:16, and that he is no respecter of persons, Acts 10:34, Romans 2:11, succeed at a design so laudably calculated to undo the heavy burdens, to let the oppressed go free, and to break every yoke, Isaiah 58:6. Based in part on the efforts of such founders, Pennsylvania and Massachusetts began abolishing slavery in 1780. Connecticut and Rhode Island did so in 1784. New Hampshire in 1792, Vermont 1793, New York 1799, and New Jersey in 1804. Some granted immediate freedom and some gradual emancipation, but slavery was either ended or officially put on the path to extinction in those states at a relatively early date and long before any nation in the world had abolished slavery. The rapid anti-slavery progress made during this period was not surprising, since the majority of the Founding Fathers were anti-slavery. This is certainly not what most Americans learn today, but that doesn't change historical reality. We'll consider some more important facts in our next lesson.